Jeff, it's great to be with you again. Our interest in portals of perception is to create a place for groundbreaking conversations. Groundbreaking in the first place means that we explore live. We don't have to be all framed and choreographed in advance. And if we are helping each other break into new grounds, perhaps something else gains interest in our conversation and other intelligence will find us. And the idea of portals of perception is to sense make in this amazing change that's unfolding now. And it has the sense of exploring the frontiers, the cutting edge of the evolutionary process, especially where development and spirituality and the change in the world all meet, and discover how we as individuals partake in this co-emergence. Because the reality is the evolutionary process is not something that's happening out there. It actually is happening right inside us and in the spaces that we create through our dialogues and explorations. And you have recently published on your website an article that you called 7 Waves of Change, Preparing for Reinvention, which I found very compelling. And I thought we could have a conversation and explore some of the ideas you are communicating there. So welcome to this discovery. What would you say by way of introduction to somebody that never met you before about your work and the propelling inquiry that guides you?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for this context to explore together. And I'm equally inspired and enthusiastic about seeing where it leads. I know there's new material waiting to emerge through our dialogue and exchange. So about me, probably the simplest way to describe what I do with individuals and with organizations is help people to see more clearly and actually feel in multiple ways how life is moving and align activities with how life is moving. So bringing together our mental understanding, our intuition, our felt sense, you could call that gut sense, and seeing where they all line up and making more enlightened decisions as a result of really listening to life and to our whole selves.
You begin by saying this article is an offering of love conceived in meditation and created in deep conversation with the whispers of life. How would you describe what are the whispers of life, and what is the nature of meditative conversations that informed you in this process? How would you describe the process you went into?
So I said a moment ago, conversations with clients, with people in an organizational setting, but what about those times when I'm inquiring into maybe it's current events and I don't have a conversation partner, but I have inspiration? I love to meditate with a question. I love to allow the mind to go relatively quiet. Maybe it's more contemplation because there's a certain amount of activity. There's an exchange. There's a listening for an answer. There's a kind of playing with almost like images and phrases, and it all actually happens quite quickly. But let me give an example. It's more helpful if I do. In early June, I had just returned from 2.5 months in Australia, where I was writing a lot of the time for the first part of the pandemic. And I was writing about the coronavirus, and I was writing about some of the trends that may be emerging as a result. And many of them are quite hopeful, as society is shifting as a result of having to change our patterns of consumption and working. A lot of that is positive, even as there's a lot of struggle. So I saw a world that was transforming. And I had already been thinking about the virus as an intelligent life form, and maybe there's some benefit that the pandemic is offering us. And so I was seeing that, well, the pandemic is here for a while. It's kind of like a wave that had rolled in quite quickly and is going to slosh around for some time doing what it does. And my sincere hope is that the harms and negative impacts can be reduced as much as possible, and that the benefits can be amplified and elevated. Either way, the pandemic is here. So it's a wave of change. And around the time that I returned to the States, in fact, half an hour before my plane landed in Seattle, the downtown area of Seattle was placed under curfew because of the peaceful protests after George Floyd's murder, which turned into at least some aspects of the protests were not so peaceful, and so curfew was imposed. And there's a whole story there, but that was part of a pattern that I came to see a few days later, a pattern of social justice rising, not just Black Lives Matter, but also indigenous voices and many other movements around the world, which were stirring and connecting and intersecting, thanks to the collective voice that was becoming more and more palpable, and fortunately more and more heard. It seems to me that that the world has been hearing the voice of Black Lives Matter. In fact, this Sunday, meaning August, let's see.
Today is August 3rd, and so this Sunday was August 2nd.
The 9th. It would be the 9th then, yes. Is Black Sun Day, S-O-N Day. And this is a day that's being broadcast from Ferguson, Missouri, where there was another unfortunate shooting of a Black teenager, I believe. And this was a couple of years ago. So the mother of that gentleman has been organizing a movement that radiates out into the world to support social justice, awareness, and action. And there's so much. I just learned about that today, and I don't have all the details memorized, but it's coming on the 9th of August, so check it out. And there's so much activity in this domain. I see and saw in early June that the second wave to roll in, the second wave of change, is social justice rising. That was the language that came to me in meditation. I was listening for, well, how do we name it? What would be an appropriate honoring name? Because it's not only Black Lives Matter, it felt more general than that. Social justice rising, like an uprising, but also rising from a very deep place, not just in resistance or reaction, but coming from life itself, like a rising wave from the deep oceans that are now stirring for justice and consciousness, and a kind of collective awakening that honors all communities, all people, and leaves no one out, and particularly does not exclude Black lives. So Black Lives Matter, again, being really the spark for this movement coalescing globally. And so with two waves, I became curious about, well, how many waves there might be. And the number that flashed into mind was 7. Maybe because it's a sacred number. Maybe there are more than 7 potentially, but I got really strongly that it would be useful to explore the possibility that there are 7 waves that are rolling in. And if 2 had been named at that point, what were the other 5 for the third wave? What related to self-liberation, which is, and we'll talk about these waves in more detail. I don't want to get ahead of the process, but the sense that people are opting out of broken systems, which then creates the possibility of people recoalescing around new systems that could work better. And the other waves kind of follow on that theme. And notably, the waves have a fundamentally positive feel to them. This is a good change. This is a change, a transformation that we collectively as humanity will feel good about on the other side. But we're in it now, and it's uncomfortable. And if we don't have perspective, it can feel like the world is ending or falling apart. And so one goal of the inquiry and the exchange with life was to see whether there might be a framing, a perspective that could help people to make meaning of these times and then respond in a more generative way and constructively contribute to the global transformation. So that became the intention for the 7 waves of change.
And you're right there that the 7 waves of change are global in nature and will over time evolve economics, industries, governments, and communities everywhere. You say that you intuited these waves to arrive in a period of 9 months, obviously a curious time, from November of 2019 through to August of 2020. So we are recording this right at the beginning of August, which is an interesting time to be discussing that. But you are actually seeing the influx of what's arriving to continue to reveal itself and to chain react through the coming decade, perhaps more than a decade. And am I reading that correctly?
Yes. So the 9 months is interesting. I found that interesting as well. When I was sourcing, another word that I use for listening deeply and bringing up practical information that can be of benefit for myself, for clients, for the world in this case. And so I was listening deeply for when would the waves emerge and what might their durations be. I know that these kinds of change processes take years and years and historically have taken decades, if not centuries. But interestingly, I noticed that all of the waves were arriving within this 9-month period, and some of them would last or slosh around longer. But by, I think it is 2029, I'm refreshing my memory because it has been revised a couple of times since I initially wrote it. There have been some tweaks. By 2029, the waves would have more or less done their work. Now, the reverberations will continue, and no doubt, once humanity is on a different path, a more life-affirming path, more aligned with, let's say, universal principles and consciousness, then the work continues of rebuilding civilization and discovering new forms of economy where more people have the opportunity to be prosperous based on doing what we love and what we're great at, but not trying to fit ourselves into a very limited model of transactionality. There's a much more ecosystemic way in which value can be co-created and exchanged that has a lot more dimensionality to it. I call this true economy, incidentally, so that may be another thread we can weave in at some point. And building a true economy, which is way, way, way more, not just incrementally more, but way more conscious than the current economy, will take time. However, by the end of the decade, I reckon, I really feel strongly, so I can see cognitively and I can feel in my heart and in my gut that we could be in a qualitatively different world where we've recognized that we've turned the corner and we need to be creative because the time has come to create the new institutions and the new models, the new forms of government, not just economy, but all of it. And it's global, so it's not like this will only occur in the United States or the Western world. It's inclusive. If it's more conscious, it's also more holistic. So it has to incorporate all of these aspects and all of these geographies.
So the last major paradigmatic shift occurred in the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century. And we can trace it to the end of the First World War, when essentially the British Empire was fading away, and with the advent of aviation and other trends that appeared, the entire global paradigm was shifting, and we, as civilization, we embraced what we later came to call modernity. And that really took 30 years, including the catastrophic phase of the Depression in America, and of course the Second World War, where at the conclusion of that process, there were some agreements about the global system. The kind of paradigm shift that you're describing, that we are intuiting here, is very different in nature. And part of what you're describing that we're about to try to unfold here affords the power to there is a crowdsourcing mechanism in the shift that's underway, in that the decisions that individuals collectively make can have a bottom-up impact because of the nature of the shift. And I don't know that we've never discussed this, but I intuit that part of the framework of the operating system you're coming out of, that you're describing, I would interpret it in the following way, and tell me where you'd correct it, which is that the realm of power, or the realm of presence, out of which all emerge, out of which all can emerge, is the sourcing and the causing realms. And out of that, first you have the realms of ideas and concepts. And so in those two realms, that is to say, what some would call metaphysic, or the energy realm, and then the realm of ideas and concepts and beliefs, change can happen there rather rapidly. The fuller manifestation in the manifest realm, in the world of matter and societies and such, can take decades to unfold. What I believe you're trying to describe in the waves of change is that the origination or the sourcing of the change is occurring now, was building perhaps in recent decades, and now is culminating. And the decisions are being made at the moment by individuals and by groups of people. And the way we participate in this co-creative decision-making, as individuals, as groups, as organizations, will shape in terms of the contributions we make. But you are also asserting that you have a strong conviction, a strong belief that collectively humanity is making the choice to not go down the path of another world war, another cataclysmic destruction, that what is actually being taken up by these waves is the higher road, the better, the regenerative path. That's how I interpreted what you offer there.
Yes. Yeah, and the parts of us individually and collectively that might be inclined to repeat the old ways, to engage in a belligerent matter rather than finding more harmonious win-win solutions, those parts are being disrupted. And it would be great to have a very specific focused conversation that would require me to be a domain expert in areas where I am not. But certainly intuitively, and when I read the news and have conversations with people who are smarter in a lot of ways than I am, it does seem clear that we're being blocked from behaving in the old ways, and that a new pattern of being and relating to one another is emerging. And I don't see that we'll have another Bretton Woods where a small group of very powerful men made some decisions about how the world economy was going to be after World War II. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not criticizing anything about history. It is what it is and has been, but now it's going to be different. And partly we could point to the internet, which has connected practically everything to everything. The Internet of Things is literally trying to connect everything to everything. And with this hyperconnectivity, resistance and friction are dropping out of the system, so that when a good idea comes along that a lot of people resonate with, it can propagate quickly. Now, one could take the critical perspective that a not so good idea that people resonate with can propagate very quickly as well. But somehow the ideas that resonate with the heart have more power. The heart and the mind, I'm not excluding the mind. You could say the heart-mind in Buddhism. So where there is that felt sense of connection and love and purpose in service, those ideas do seem to have more power. And so the waves are energized more powerfully than some of the forces that are in inertia, um, trying to maintain the status quo.
You already spoke to wave one, which started to emerge in November of 2019, which you qualified as the coronavirus pandemic. And one of the early points you made there was that the pandemic disrupted the activities of business as usual, which I've certainly experienced in my work with my clients. And the beauty of this is that everybody on the planet experienced that. And so what I've done is, as I reflected on those waves, I thought we can explore some of the metaphysical lessons or metaphysical offerings that each wave begin to introduce, and also perhaps with some of them inquire whether that's the wave or whether there is another underlying wave, and the way you describe the wave is an expression of another process. So first, is there anything you'd add to that wave one in the way you have initially described it? We've all now been living into this wave in a very visible way for 4 or 5 months. So we're not, by describing it, breaking into new grounds, but I am able to frame 2 or 3 ideas in terms of the metaphysical offering of that wave. Before I go there, is there anything else you'd offer in terms of how you outline the story of wave one?
Well, what I appreciate about this wave is it's visible and it's visceral. We have a very embodied experience of the changes that are taking place. So it is more real as a result of being more embodied. And in April, I think it was, there was a survey in the United Kingdom that asked about 500 respondents whether they might want to return to the way things were before the pandemic. And 91% of respondents said they did not want to return to the way things were before. And maybe none of us really knew what we were signing up for. We didn't know the pandemic was going to linger and have second waves and maybe third waves. But I've heard lots of people, and especially the younger generation, say this is an opportunity to create a new future, to be liberated from a future that we didn't want. And so here we are, and it is embodied. And I'm sure there are deeper principles that are at play. When I was writing the 7 waves, it felt very important to stay accessible and not too esoteric, because I can do that. I can go into esoterics, but it seemed necessary to stay, at least for the purpose of the article, in the realm of the secular understandings. I come alive when we can explore the roots in consciousness and spirit of the manifested changes, and the waves are expressions of those deeper principles. So yeah, please, whatever you'd like to explore on that level, feel free.
Well, so the first perhaps educational gift brought to us by the pandemic is an idea that's not new for people that explored spiritually and are curious and awake in that sense. And that's the idea that the human is a transmitting agent. Because all of a sudden, an idea that you'd never consider to be something that everybody is prepared to embrace, we faced a reality that we recognize that any person, anywhere, wherever they travel and whatever place they walk into, they became potentially a transmitting agent of the virus. But once you embrace that idea, there is a broader horizon that opens up there, because once we admit to ourselves that each and every human is a transmitting agent, we are embracing a whole reframed idea about what human life is. And we perhaps begin to recognize that that's part of the meaning of being alive, showing up here as a transmitting agent. And we can transmit and become an agency for whatever viruses below the line. And I don't just mean by that the coronavirus, but I mean the virus of panic and anxiety and fear, as well as we can transmit the virons, which is the essence of the word environment. Okay, so what a viron is, whatever creates the environment, we can transmit the virons of trust and compassion and love and confidence and discovery and learning and so much more in terms of embracing the broader, more enlightened and enlightening side of the human potential. So, and once we embrace the idea that I am, you are, each and every human is a transmitting agent, there is a whole new realization in terms of the responsibility of being alive, because what it means is what I say yes to and what I say no to, what I choose to support and what I give my power to is no longer just viewed through the lens of how it impacts me. Whatever I contribute to and support, I transmit in the most obvious biological sense, but also obviously in the mental, emotional, psycho-spiritual sense. And I therefore power that bank of possibilities in the human sphere. So I thought that was one huge, big message the pandemic brought. The second was that, guess what? We all started to very quickly put masks on our face. And that was a sudden and a rapid change. And I thought, what could the meaning of this new behavior represent? What could it be about? And it occurs to me that because you'd see heads of states, you'd see the head of China wearing masks, and you'd see billionaires wearing masks. So all of a sudden there was a behavior that was embraced by all in a non-differential way, regardless to your status in society and your wealth and such. And what did it do? It essentially covered the most identifying features with which we recognize people, our face. And in some way, it shifted us from the individual focus to a collective destiny for humanity at this time. And in that sense, it's almost as though that behavior, because as well, part of the messaging was you do this not just to help yourself, but you do this to help the people around you. So the message was, don't be so selfishly just based in yourself. Transition into a consciousness that's serving of the greater society you're part of. So right there was what in other circumstances you would say this is like a 2 or 3 steps in the evolutionary ladder where a person will be asked to spend a lifetime and people were called to do that in 2 or 3 weeks. Which leads me to the third nature of change that or gift that I observed through the pandemic. As you know, I work with large global corporations about the future and strategic and business and organizational future. And one thing people always like to say is they say, change is difficult, it takes time. And I believe one of the unique elements of the collective experience that humanity has just gone through is that we recognize that it's not true. It is simply not true. The claim that change requires a lot of time and is difficult is not true. All we need is the right reason to catalyze change. And when we have the right reason, we can change overnight. Literally, overnight, humanity embraced new way of behaving, new way of working, new way of connecting with each other, new social behavioral code. We did this just like that in a way that you cannot trace with any other species on the planet in terms of the velocity of change. So there is now a shared collective experience, the essence of which is change is not difficult, it is very easy if we have the right reason. And change is not gradual, rather it can be spontaneous. And we can actually, if we have the right reason, turn on a dime. So these are some of the teachings that the pandemic brought to us, which you describe in wave one. What would you say to that, or what would you add or comment?
Well, I love everything that you've said now, and I agree completely. In terms of the ability to change quickly, certainly the circumstances have favored the rapid change. And so we have the reason, we have conducive conditions. Perhaps it's a bit like the supersaturated solution when you have the right temperature and molarity or concentration, and you drop in a crystal that has the appropriate shape and structure, then the rest of the fluid assumes that structure or self-organizes around that seed crystal. So there were a few positive ideas that were compelling, and people's behaviors have changed, not easily. For instance, the mask. I totally agree that we're learning to take ourselves out of the center of our preoccupation and pay more attention to the well-being of others. I have a friend who started a campaign called My Mask is for You, and she's been interviewed by various news organizations around the country because it's a beautiful message. Now, not everyone embraces that message yet, and maybe not everyone will, and maybe not everyone has to. There is the theory that it only really takes 10% of a population to become very coherent around a new idea. And because that 10% is much more coherent than the 90%, that new idea gains traction over time. So we will find out. And yes, I feel the deep teachings of the pandemic. I know we could give a lot more time. We could probably spend our whole time together talking about just the first wave. So I'll follow your lead on where you'd like to go from here.
Wave two, which you describe as social justice rising, which you intuited will take us from May of 2020 to May of 2025, you framed as the wave through which unconscious biases are becoming widely recognized, and these will be largely eliminated within 3 generations. So say more what you meant by that, and I believe I understand your idea of 3 generations, but how did that show up in your contemplation?
Well, people have said to me, it seems very optimistic to suppose that our grandchildren's children won't be carrying the word that comes is bigotry and animosity of their ancestors, that somehow we could collectively release those patterns of thinking and being and feeling from our minds and hearts. And yet, intuitively, going back into that meditative contemplation, I was getting 2.7 generations. So sometimes the information can be quite specific. And I feel that there is an invitation in this. It isn't that I'm predicting the future and that it's already a foregone conclusion that in 3 generations, the different groupings of humanity will get along. I feel that possibility exists, and we also have to choose it, and we have to practice. So the 7 waves of change is a call to consciousness and a call to collective practice to see if we can in fact implement this vision for what could be. And in terms of the collective patterns of unconsciousness, I would say anywhere that we don't feel love for one another, that's unconsciousness, because as we become more awake, love overflows. That's empirically what happens. So I can't theorize and say why it should be true. It seems that love is at the foundation of who and what we are. And so as we become more aware of ourselves, when we self-realize and we make real our nature, that what that is love, and our behaviors become loving. And if we can turn on a dime and put on a mask because my mask is for you, well, maybe we can stop repeating just out of rote and sort of muscle memory in the mind, the aphorisms and negativity of previous generations. And
Yeah.
I suspect, initially I wrote 2 generations, but then I tuned in because somebody pushed back, and I felt and got 2.7 generations. So let's do better than 3. Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's see how well we can do.
The other teaching that I found in this, because you're talking about a corrective process, a collective corrective process. And there is a teaching that comes through that, and it concerns the appreciation of corrective cycles in the evolutionary process. Because you'd think that through the 60s and the 70s and into the beginning of the 20th century and an African American elected to the White House, that those issues were resolved, but the fact of the matter, they were not. And the fact of the matter is many people feel that they were not addressed sufficiently. And there is something about the evolutionary process that I'm going to use a very crude metaphor that is expressed in the way the markets work. Because of course the markets, they simply mimic natural patterns and cadences. So when you have a bull market and whatever commodity or item rushes ahead of itself in the bull market, it goes through corrective cycles where it needs to test again, why is this equity or commodity truly in a bull market? And that means that the people that are invested in that sector, they have to test their fundamental belief. And I know for many people who explore evolutionarily, the idea of comparing it to the market will feel very crude, but what we are interested in are the patterns. Part of what's happening now is that society at large is experiencing a corrective cycle where we are retracing part of what occurred through the mid-20th century and was not inclusive of the entirety of that potential. So when the trace of the bull market of evolution rushes forward and it is not addressing sufficiently all the elements of the ecosystem, such as in the idea of social justice, then what it means is that evolution progressed with bugs in the system. And that development cycle carried certain obsolescence bugs. And unless they are fixed, unless they are corrected, the whole system implodes. And we are right now through the implosion of the system. What you're asserting is that the choice to engage creatively and lovingly and the sense of assuming personal responsibility and participation in this means we're actually engaging with healing the operating system that enabled evolution to rush forward with obsolescence bugs, which is why it is so critical to become consciously present. The first participation we make is not just going out to demonstrate in the street, but that we're actually bearing witness and that we are actually taking position in terms of where do we stand in terms of our values and what we believe in. So that is the teaching that I heard and found in the second wave of social justice rising.
Yes, I absolutely resonate with the notion of an operating system upgrade. And the previous operating system did a lot of good in certain respects, and it externalized a lot of harm and impact, not only for communities of color, but impact on the natural environment. And so we've seen all kinds of harm in rainforests right now. The Brazilian rainforest is on fire again. So the Amazon is very much jeopardized by these kinds of activities and elsewhere. And of course, climate change is the sum total of our unconsciousness around externalities of our energy consumption, largely burning fossil fuels. And again, I'm not saying that's bad. There was a time when that was the best form of energy that we had available. And now that is changing. We actually have the sun. We know how to harness the power of the sun and the wind and the waves and the elements. It seems so simple. And every solution that we need is available. I want to give just one, I'm on a roll here with the environment, but I want to give an example. So flying around the world is frowned upon for good reason because of the carbon emissions. It turns out there is a crop, camelina. And when camelina is, the oils are extracted and mixed in a particular way with jet fuel, there is an 80% reduction in the CO2 emissions. So imagine 80% less CO2 generated by air travel. And we could do that tomorrow. Like, this is proven. It's not even experimental. It's just a matter of will. So coming back to your point, when the collective decides, profound change can take place. Now let's bring this back to social justice. When will the collective decide that it's not okay for communities to live in fear and terror, that their children will be taken from them violently, and that it's not okay for communities of color to bear disproportionately the burden of climate change and pandemics and pollution from all manner of sources, that it's not okay for there to be these disparities in our societies. In fact, these disparities are a cancer that affects the whole. So there's really no positive, there's no benefit to persisting social injustice.
Yeah.
There can really only be social justice if we are to continue. We can't have the power we have technologically and have social injustice. So life itself is rising. It's rising through people of color and all people. And I really want to honor Black Lives Matter. And also I want to name, I believe it was Michael Brown back in Ferguson, who lost his life. And in naming, literally naming the people and the instances of injustice, we are no longer shying away from the work at hand.
Your wave 3, which you intuited to begin in June of 2020 and run through July of 2022, you call the beginning of widespread self-liberation. And you speak there about the idea of people are opting out of the structures of society in which they no longer have confidence. And when I reflected on the ideas you framed for that third wave, I intuited, and by the way, you are actually already in the comments you're making, you are connecting all the different waves in some of the thoughts you already offered. And I saw in this wave 3, there are actually 2 different dimensions. The first of which you describe as self-liberation, I intuit is perhaps even more about being individuated into universal life. The idea of being individuated into universal life has this notion that we are each empowered through this transition into the self-authoring as a way of becoming a matured vehicle in the participation with the causing realms with which life is arising. And that unto itself was a wave by itself in and expressed through these ideas of self-liberation, which is that there is a summoning upon life for each and every person to now claim their lone decisive conscious power to become a self-authored participant in the story of life. In other words, you can no longer hide behind the systems and the organizations and the institutions and walk away from the individual responsibility. So there is the liberation and the self-authoring, and there is the responsibility in it. And it's important to actually bring those 2 sides, because this is where the liberal and the conservative ideas need to be taken out of the realms of politics and be brought into the realms of the constitution of a life, because you need the liberating part of you and you need the maturing, responsible part of you to become a fully individuated life, without which you cannot realize your fullest potential. So I saw that to be one element of wave three. And then there is the aspect that you already alluded to, which is to do with new self-arising alternative structures of collaborative leadership, distributed leadership, and as you said, not a Bretton Woods type of global leadership, but rather the local and regional leadership that arises in all sorts of ways. They perhaps are one and the same wave, or two different elements or two different waves, with the individuated life in the universe and the co-arising of collective leadership are two profound and important characteristics of this epochal shift that's underway.
What I felt initially with wave three, which is languaged as the beginning of widespread self-liberation. So there'll be layers and layers, I feel as well, of what self-liberation means, liberating the unique, universal, individual potential, for instance, and then experiencing that collectively and co-creating the new systems, perhaps in subsequent waves. What I saw as maybe an early sign of the self-liberation trend is people opting out of systems that don't function well. And I had a friend who once upon a time didn't pay her taxes as a way of protesting the government spending so much on military means, and that didn't work very well for her. So it wasn't safe necessarily to opt out in that way at that time. Now, it may well be safe, as millions and millions of people say, you know, we don't wish to participate in systems that do not really protect us. We do not wish to have the federal government present in our cities with officers who don't even have name badges and things like that. Now, I'm not taking a political position there. I don't know enough, frankly. I'm just looking at where are the tensions playing out. And if people feel en masse that the federal government isn't serving them, and they find a way to lodge their complaint by stepping out. And I remember a book that was titled Walk Out, Walk On by Margaret Wheatley. And I feel like that's now happening. People are walking out of the burning house, walking on, and maybe eventually creating new ones. So there are examples. There aren't maybe a lot of examples yet. I think of the sovereignty movement, people who are declaring themselves to be sovereign and finding ways to do that are supposedly kind of legally solid. And again, I don't have the knowledge I would like to have in this domain. And there may be questions around whether that really works in the way that people think so. But nevertheless, it's the impulse. It's the impulse to be free of encumbering systems. And I think also about vaccines. This is another huge hot button. There are people, again, I'm not taking a position, but there are people who say vaccines aren't safe in the way they're currently manufactured, and it leads to harm on a large scale. If that's true, then it makes all the sense in the world for people to decline to have their children vaccinated. It may be true, it may not be true. That's for others to say, others who know a lot more than I do. But if our medicine isn't protecting us, then we need a more enlightened form of medicine. If our government isn't protecting us and ensuring our well-being, which is enshrined in the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States of America, then we really need to look at that. And it seems that people need to actually exit the dysfunctional forms in order to create the possibility of looking at the roots of the matter.
And wave four paints, in my mind, a direction. When you talk about exiting, a directionality one can exit with in terms of their mind, because what you're describing in wave four is the rejection of poverty as morally reprehensible. And you're saying poverty results from an obsolete social operating system. We can build societies that are regenerative and flourishing, which value and invest in the education, health, well-being, and all while rewarding individual creativity and initiative. And when I reflected on that, I recognized perhaps the core, the deeper underlying wave to represent this idea, which you already touched earlier in this conversation, the idea of the shift from extractive to regenerative economy. So we've been operating, you could say, for the last 300 years, from, say, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, increasingly with an extractive paradigm. And that worked very well for a while, but ultimately impoverished the planet while it produced poverty, which is an interesting analogous way, because what it is teaching us, again, in the metaphysical awareness, that what happens in the human happens in the planet, and what happens in the planet happens in the human. And if we impoverish the planet from her natural resources, we shouldn't be shocked and surprised that we will see this extraordinary inequality and poverty throughout the world. What I therefore believe the case to be in this wave, that this is ultimately about, again, the operating system obsolescence of that extractive economy that essentially built the entire paradigm, including when the economy shifted to the internet, because the entire way the internet now operates is also extractive, where instead of the barons of industry, the barons of the large internet complexes, they are extracting our data to convert into their tremendous wealth. But the promise, I believe, you are communicating in wave 4 is the idea that regenerative economy and regenerative everything is part of the paradigm on the rise. And I can offer the testimony of working with a number of companies where the idea of regenerative agriculture had become central. So you have large companies that embrace this idea not just because it will do well for the brand, but from deep conviction that it's the right thing to do. And part of the regenerative cycle of what is now arising is actually the convergence of what is right and what is good is also not just the just thing, but will also pay in terms of profitability and well-being for all of the systems involved. So that's what I'm reading in wave 4, ultimately a transition, an invitation to pivot from extraction to generative economy.
I'm with you. And this connects back with the notion of true economy, an enlightened economy, an economy where everyone is participating fully with their true gifts and being supported, including financially, in doing so. And I see that there's a great opening right now for people to find who they are authentically. And this relates to that individuation process you named, to find who we are in our soul, in our expression, and bring that forward. And if we do that in sufficient numbers, we're going to find that the pieces all link, the inputs and the outputs connect, and we can have a different kind of economy. Until that day, Gandhi's statement that poverty is the worst form of violence continues to reverberate for me, that systematic, institutionalized poverty is killing hundreds of millions of people, shortening the lives of billions of people. No one would really choose that if we could have an alternative. Maybe we haven't realized we could have an alternative. The coronavirus pandemic has now created a situation where we know we have to rebuild, and you have government ministers saying, let's make sure we rebuild green. Well, let's also make sure we rebuild just, and we rebuild with economic fairness in the operating system, because we've learned a thing or two since Bretton Woods, and we could make some fundamental changes now that produce a society that is regenerative, that supports healing and increasing levels of health through regeneration on a regular basis. So as we evolve, we can become healthier, we can become more just and live longer. What's interesting is that birth rates are set to decline precipitously around the world. That's another really interesting trend that will make it easier to distribute food and other resources universally. Even in, I think it was the 60s, Buckminster Fuller said, we have enough to go around. If we were to reallocate and change how we distribute resources, we could turn weaponry into livingry. And he did the math, and I'll trust him on that. It seems like we have even more capability now to alter our delivery systems and upgrade our operating system. And yes, if we can declare that poverty is morally reprehensible, it's not just something we would like to minimize. It is actually a significant bug. It is a fatal flaw in the operating system at this point and must be corrected. Yeah, then we'll have the will to make those changes.
So let me try and cover wave 5, 6, and 7 together, because you in many ways already touched all of them. Wave 5, you describe as institutions evolve and institutions decline. You talk there about governments and institutions of all types that do not cultivate inclusiveness, compassion, wisdom, and consciousness, and that they will be unable to resolve the complex tangle of social and environmental failures. And so this too, I read that to mean that systems that are self-serving in an extractive way, they will not have the mandate to survive or to thrive in the next new paradigm. And they will become obsolete. Whereas the definition, the criterion by which you will measure whether a system has a purpose for being inside the new paradigm that you are intuiting is emerging, is that it will have to generate, to produce surplus. Surplus of well-being, surplus of contribution, surplus of happiness, surplus of creativity and innovation in a way that supports the broader ecosystem. So that was an element of that I saw in wave 5, because ultimately what you're describing there is that we need to become sun-like. Okay, sun-like in the sense of emitting more or giving back more to the environment, such that we are life-giving rather than life-sucking. Your wave 6 you describe as demonstrations of unity and consciousness leading to peaceful changes. And there you are describing what you already alluded to in this idea of peaceful protests, that in some areas work, in some areas did not work, but then people even peacefully protest by what they choose to support and where they choose to part with their money and where they don't. So there are all sorts of ways in which people participate in that. But again, what I saw in wave 6 was that you are intuiting the idea of the re-architecting of power. The re-architecting of power, the reframing of what power is, the reframing of what power means in terms of how it is used and what it is here to serve. And we talk about social power, influencing power, financial power, political power, this huge big something that is at the center of the human society, the application of those variety of power levels, that is being redefined, and that if the future is about self-authoring, then we will need to re-author also the meaning of power and the utility and function of power as you talk about spirit, you talk about the sourcing and the causing realms. Well, in the manifest realms, the direct, most near link to those realms is how power is being applied. So all that needs to be re-architected if there is to be an enlightened humanity on Earth.
Yes, I agree. And I want to read just the last few words from wave 6. All countries will experience the power of the peaceful. So true power, in other words, the power to abuse, for me, ceases to be power. I'm looking for another word now, bullying perhaps, forcefulness, but not power. And if we have a different definition, that may help, but by their fruits ye shall know them. So it is through our behaviors that we will know how far we have come. And there are places right now where protest is illegal in the world, and yet people's voices are finding other ways. The internet again helps with that. And TikTok, it's interesting to talk about possibly shutting down major internet applications for communication. Brazil at some point had turned off WhatsApp, but that didn't last. So one way or another, the voice, the collective voice and wisdom will out. And we're seeing it now. The extent to which we can display our unity and our conscience in a very visible way makes it clearer, to quote the powers that be, that change is really happening. So in this wave, I am seeing that there will be voluntary changes. So you might see institutions that come to recognize they are now obsolete, voluntarily disbanding, saying, okay, we know there needs to be another way. So we relinquish our power. And at that point, I anticipate there will be alternatives. And there are already all the alternatives that we could possibly need. They exist. New forms of democracy even that use the internet in native ways, because the American form is fairly old. Even though it's a young country, our form of democracy goes back to when horses were the fastest way to move information around, and that is so not the case now. And our democracy could be way more inclusive, with fewer layers of intermediation that are subject to corrupting influences. So collectively we'll architect a new democracy as a peaceful citizenry. We won't get it done without the peace, because we need the coherence in order to form a new pattern. And it's coming.
The seventh wave, wave 7, you describe as emergence of novel forms of evolutionary governance. And you make the point there about how the emphasis is going to be on bioregionalism. And because that will help to ensure that human populations harmonize with the natural environment, and that administrative boundaries align with the living systems of Earth. So you are intuiting there that in the coming years, new and more awakened forms of government will implement policies and practices rooted in wisdom and the lessons of history that are socially just and ecologically sound for all generations to come. So I'm going to try and make two big points here, one of which may be the first point that will lead us to some kind of a creative tension, or not. We're going to find out in a minute, which is all great. I believe what you are pointing to in wave 7 is that the evolutionary impulse is being brought to express itself as a central, implicit, and shaping influence in every aspect of life. That recognizing and appreciating the fact that we are part of an evolutionary system, and what that means must become central in every aspect of life. I think that's the underlying wave that is expressed in what you're describing as wave 7. And it is that which brings me to what could be a little bit of a friction and a difficult challenge to address, only because, and this is where this idea of bugs in the evolutionary system, in the way it accelerated itself over the last several decades, is now playing out. Because so much, Jeff, of the spiritually and developmentally awake and alert, these are people that are often, they come from left-leaning, liberal-leaning side of the political ecosystem. And they have often been imbued with postmodernity. And I'm going to assert that postmodernity has an important evolutionary function. Its function was to break out of the dominance of legacy structures and all systems and institutions. Okay, postmodernity said, away with all that, I am now going to become empowered by myself. This is the idea of, essentially what I'm saying is the evolutionary impulse that unleashed postmodernity at its deeper level is the idea of the summon to individuated life in the universe. But what happened was that postmodernity had taken that largely as a horizontal translation and said, we're going to do away with any structure, with any order, with any hierarchy, because all of it is representative of the historic suppressive system. And as a result of that, what came to the foreground was the important notion here is postmodernity became more obsessed with breaking from the past than pathfinding a way into a new emergent future. And there is an important distinction. So breakout from legacy structures became conflated and one and the same as separating from any idea of natural order. And you now have a scenario where the thinking in woke world, if I'm pronouncing the word correctly, is that at the hands of the postmodern revolution, we have now a scenario where people believe that the entirety of the story of life is socially constructed. And if I come up with an idea in my head, then it is true because I say so, because I decide that it is so. And in my appreciation, what we're seeing there is a divorce from natural order. Because when I look at the human design, I say the fact of the matter is I have two hands and they seem to be wanting to operate wonderfully together. They don't seem to quarrel with each other. But we seem to, in humanity, take all the two sides, all the two polarities, and fight with each other instead of collaborate. But add to this that we all have the head sitting at the top of the spine and the legs at the bottom of the spine. So I say that when I look at the human design, there is a naturally arising order. That when we say no, what we decide as a society is reality. In other words, we take the socially constructed idea to be the only reality there is, and we divorce ourselves from the reality of we are able to enjoy life and perceive because we're living on this wonderfully rich planet that's traveling, whooshing through space around the sun, that's whooshing around the center of the galaxy. We are here able to even socially construct because of this galactic actuality. But the moment we separate ourselves from it, we run the risk that we're living in a crazy world. And this is where I say that I'm looking for another word because conservative is not the right word. The soul, which is the enacting and orchestrating and operating essence of a life, is adherent, is conservative in the sense that it works through the human design. I can wake up in the morning tomorrow or next week and decide that I want to have my eye not in the front of the face but in the back of the face, but my soul will not recognize this crazy idea. It will say, no, I have to follow the natural order. I have to conserve your natural order and allow you to enjoy the range of new creative liberation within the constraints of your design, because it is that provides you safety and continuity and order. So this is the tension we must bring, I believe, Jeff, into this idea of supporting and enabling evolutionary systems to arise. because what we now are seeing, we are at that, this is part of the corrective chaos we are now experiencing, where postmodernity said trueness to self means I just believe in what I think and I feel in this minute. And when we do that, we divorce ourselves from the natural order of life that provides us nourishment and support and is the foundation of all that may arise. And so I believe part of the corrective cycle we are in is one where the liberating side of discovering the fuller range of individuated universal life must come together, that's the other hand, with the discovery of natural orders and systems and how those, they call for responsibility and some kind of conservatism, because we want to conserve, for example, this planet. We want to protect it. So those need to find a way to work together if indeed the evolutionary principle is to find expression in the way of life and in the way of society and organizational systems that will arise.
I fail to find any disagreement, even tension. It seems to me you've resolved the tension largely by saying we need the horizontal and the vertical. In the 7 Waves article, I say we're bringing forth policies and practices that are rooted in wisdom and the lessons of history. So the wisdom includes our connection to the whole, to the universal, to source from the causal realms of being. And so I would consider that vertical, and we could explore whether it's only vertical. I feel like this is a model and it's approximate. And then the horizontal is the people, collective, consciousness even at this point in time and our current state of evolution and what we've figured out so far. If we've really individuated fully as universe, then we're universally connected and aware and appreciative of the different factors of existence. It's not all socially created. Reality is not entirely a social construct. The simulacrum is a very interesting and in some ways empowering idea. That we might live in a matrix is useful in certain regards as we contemplate the ways in which we've been unconscious. But the pendulum swung with postmodernity. It overshot. There was maybe a little too much of that. It's natural, maybe even necessary at a certain level of consciousness where we've been collectively. There will be overshoots, there will be pendulum swings, and the pendulum will have to swing back as a corrective, as you've described so beautifully. When we bring the horizontal and the vertical together, we have a whole model and a way of being and living that is more considerate of all of the ways in which we exist and can come together and socialize and create economic and political systems that will continue to evolve for sure. I predict, though, that future evolutions will be less painful as we become more conscious and more inclusive in our consideration. So may it be so. I feel a lot of hope at this time that we are choosing a new path. I really respect those who would conserve what has worked well. And not everything that has worked well will continue to work well, but a lot of it will. For instance, in biology, the human system includes adaptations that appeared hundreds of millions of years ago and to this day still work. I'm thinking the intestines and some of the ways in which they work. People who know more about biology have pointed out how certain fishes that evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, or whatever the time frame may be, they live on in us. And so there is a lot to conserve. There's a lot of value in history to preserve. And nature actually codifies vast wisdom. So let's start by conserving nature. And then the liberal perspective, those who would like to change and run experiments and see if we can't find a better way, of course. I would love for us to find ways to integrate both approaches to life so that we can be more whole.
Beautifully said. And the awareness that is awakening in me when you talk about overshooting is my first experience when I was first trained to in the Air Force to practice landing. The first time I approached landing, I produced an extraordinary overshoot. And what did I do the next time around? I produced an extraordinary undershoot. And nearly landed in the sands in front of the runway. The promise of what you are painting, with truly being able to embrace the horizontal and the vertical into a holistic, unified system of arising, is that we may be transitioning into a time where we will need to do less of those extreme, cataclysmic, catastrophic events such as occurred in the early 20th century. And so I'm with you in the description of that and in the co-creative effort that somehow pioneers these and enable these frontiers while the rest of society is emerging and transforming. So thank you so very much for sharing those 7 waves. And we've just, I feel, touched the beginning of some of those interpretations. So more to come, more to be developed.
Thank you, Aviv. I've really enjoyed this co-creative exploration, and I've been enlightened and enlivened by your perspectives and additions, and I appreciate the depth that you bring in terms of the metaphysical understanding and the real clarity around how evolution works, how change processes work at the human level and in nature. And I know I have a lot to learn from you, and I look forward to further exploration. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jeff.